right, we are at the Antioch congregation. We are studying the churches of the New Testament. Congregations probably be a better way of putting it. We talked about the Jerusalem church. We began at Acts 2, where it all started. And we talked about the Jerusalem church. We talked about her derivation, her development, how she grew, and then we also talked about her difficulties. That's going to kind of be our theme as we go through these congregations. We're going to talk about their derivation, where they began, how they began. We're going to talk about their development, how they grew, and then we'll talk about some of the struggles they faced. Our hope in doing that is to encourage us that we are a New Testament congregation, but there are times when we have difficulties. There are times when we look at the church, we look at our communities, and we suffer sometimes. We're like, man, God, why us? Well, it's not just why us. It's been this battle of good and evil, of darkness and light from the very start of humanity, and in particular from the start of the church. I think about 2 weeks ago, and I just forgot to address this question, but I was reminded by my wife about a question she had asked in class, and I never answered. The question was this: about how many years transpired between Acts chapter 2 and the stoning of Stephen? Well, I am going to give you my best guess on this from study, and it's not as point blank as you might think it might be, but I'm going to say about 3 to 5 years, depending on how you date everything, and depending on how scholars date stuff, which I have to laugh at that, because you will find some scholars that say it was about a year. You'll have some scholars say it was about 5 years. You'll have some scholars say it was about 3 years. And they give their reasonings for it. And so I told Jolene my best guess, don't hold me to this, don't write me up if it's wrong, but my best guess will be about 3 to 5 years. The reason there's a little bit of differentiation here is some folks start Acts 2 in Jerusalem at 30 A.D., and I believe it was about 33 A.D., okay? In fact, I believe it was Guyan Woods that did a very documented case of when Acts 2 took place. And he actually has it down to the month and everything. And if you research that, you can find that. I don't have the notes here for that, but he really led heavily on that side of things. And so if you take 33 A.D., your years may vary, but about 3 to 5 years from the start of the church till really that persecution with Stephen started. So hopefully that'll help you. But again, take that and dig into it and see what you might be able to come on even to a little bit more precise. We know it wasn't, a span of 15 years, and we know it wasn't a span of 3 months. So I think 3 to 5 would answer that question. So that'll be the answer to that question, or at least that's my answer to it. Thank you for the question, Jolene. Thank you for reminding me of that question. I hadn't researched it, and she asked me again, hey, what about that? And I said, you know what, I didn't research that. I said, I got to go back. So I wrote it down and went back and researched it, and that's what we come up with. All right, talking about the Antioch Church now. We're moving into a little different region. Now, there were 2 Antiochs in the Bible, or 2 very prominent Antiochs in the Bible. You know what's interesting? Let me say this before I ask the question. Last week we began this study on the church in Antioch. There's no prophecy here. There's no weird stuff. I just find it very interesting how things work out. Last week, there was a shooting that took place in a school near Antioch, Tennessee. And I just thought that was kind of interesting. I don't think there's anything tied to it. I'm not weird on you or nothing. But I thought that was kind of interesting how that just took place, and we're just starting this study. But I promise you, that church that place in Antioch, Tennessee, was not the Antiochs we're speaking of. Okay, so somebody came out and said, "Hey, there's another Antioch you need to be aware of." And I said, "Well, what's that one?" And I thought, well, man, what one did I miss in the Bible? A prominent one that I missed in the Bible. And they said, well, Antioch, Tennessee. And I actually had a friend from there. So, but that's where that shooting took place in that school last week. That's not the Antioch we're speaking of. There were 2 in the Bible, prominent Antiochs. Does anybody remember one of those Antiochs? Antioch of Syria. Very good. There was another one as well. Pisidia, very good. Antioch of Pisidia. Which one are we dealing with now in this study? What Antioch? Syria, Antioch of Syria. Very good. And I heard a couple other people say that. Awesome. Good job. So that's the one that we're talking about in our study here. This city became the hub, if you will, of Paul's missionary journeys. Now, Paul came to Antioch of Pisidia a little bit later on in his first missionary journey. He visited that city. But Antioch of Syria is, and I had maps up last week, and if you have a Bible map, you can find it. It was along the Mediterranean coast, and it was along the Orontes River, and it was about 13 miles from the coastline, but it was kind of where Paul started all his missionary tours and ended all his missionary tours, those being the three major missionary journeys that Paul was on. Many people count his journey to Rome as a fourth missionary tour, and it certainly was, but obviously he didn't end back in Antioch of Syria on that tour. Antioch of Syria was the hub. It was a population of about 500,000 people, as we noted last week, and it was the third largest city as a Roman province, only second to Alexandria and Rome itself, Rome being the largest, Alexandria being the second largest, and then Antioch of Syria being the third. It was a center of worship for idolatry, which many of these places became centers of idolatry. This was a very sinful place. There were prostitutes all over there. In fact, in the first century, and I'm sure even after that, but we're more concerned about the first century because that's where our study finds us in the Bible. There were all kinds of sexual deviancies that were taking place in the name of worship to idolatry. And, of course, that infiltrated into the church, no doubt. The church had problems with that as well. But it's amazing how this Antioch of Syria was such a sinful place. And I said last week, in fact, we ended with this, I said, who would ever choose to start a church there, a congregation there? Well, the answer to that is the Holy Spirit chose that, okay? And so, again, we see the power of the gospel. The power of the gospel, it is amazing. Don't ever underestimate it. Let's look at number one, the derivation, the beginning of this congregation. So if you go back to Acts chapter 8, we're going to find a couple of things interesting here. So Acts chapter 8, we really had just ended the stoning of Stephen, in first Acts chapter 7. And then as we open Acts chapter 8, we see Saul is in hearty agreement to putting Stephen to death. He's there holding the garments of those that stoned him and understand that there's no doubt, and maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I would not be a bit surprised that Saul didn't throw some stones as well at Stephen, but he certainly was in hearty agreement to the stoning of Stephen. There's a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem. Remember, Acts chapter 1 and verse 8, God said how my church is going to work. It's going to begin in Jerusalem. It's going to go to Judea, Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the world. And what's ironic about this, and what I'm really encouraged about, sometimes, God will move and He'll use things that happen, even if they're bad things. He'll use them to His glory. So when we look at Jerusalem, the church began in Jerusalem, and for a few years it was really growing and really strong in Jerusalem. But God had to somehow get His people to leave that place. And the way He used, what He used is kind of ironic, if you think about it. He used persecution. Now, did God bring the persecution? I don't believe God brought the persecution. What I believe is God used sinful man as His tool to get His church moving in the direction He needed it to move. And so this great persecution begins the church in Jerusalem. If you look at verse 1 of Acts 8, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Some devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentation over him. And Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house, dragging off men and women to put them into prison. And therefore, look at verse 4, those that were scattered abroad went everywhere, preaching the word. Now that's interesting. That is exactly what God's plan was. Persecution comes to the church. We think this is terrible. Why would God, and here's atheism's argument, okay? Why would a loving God, a God that loves us and that cares for us, why would he allow bad things to happen? I can't believe that God wouldn't step in and stop this persecution. Well, let me tell you something. God doesn't operate, number one, that way. Number two, it wasn't God that began this persecution. The persecution began with sin. Sin was the result, or the reason, we should say, of the persecution. People hating people for not believing what they believed. People not looking at evidence that was clear evidence around them. People not even following the laws of Judaism. That, Judaism still, while it was different than Christianity, there should have been some common things here that kept Jews not persecuting the church, but they hated it. They absolutely hated the church, and Saul was one of those. And so God used persecution to develop his people to get out of Jerusalem and to spread the gospel everywhere. Now, I want you to just, for a second, flip back to Acts chapter 6 and verse 5. Now, this is before the persecution took place, but there was a problem in the church. And you remember that problem. There was some neglect of widows. And the statement, what they said is, the apostles said, go ahead and pick you out 7 men, verse 3, full of the Spirit and of wisdom. Put them in charge of this task. We're going to devote ourselves to prayer and the ministry of the word. Verse 5, the statement found approval with the whole congregation. They chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit, and Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenes, and notice, Nicholas, a proselyte, from where? From Antioch. That's powerful. That's interesting. So we have a man, one of the men who was a proselyte. What's a proselyte? Yeah. He essentially wasn't born a Jew, but he was converted to Judaism. He came into Judaism later, and he was from Antioch. And then we'll find that that's the Antioch of Syria. In fact, let's keep the theme going. Let's find out how this church began over in Antioch of Syria. Flip to Acts 11. Acts 11. Now, the persecution began in Acts 8, and then when you kind of start reading about it, you see all this turmoil in Acts 8, but then you see a lot of great things. Philip goes to Samaria, and of course, then you read that great conversion account in Acts 8. Philip's down there in Samaria, he's baptizing people. People are, respond to the gospel, and then the Spirit says, hey, Philip, I really need you. And if you think about this is exactly what he said to him. He said, I need you to leave that great preaching and that great opportunity you have down there, that great gospel meeting that's going on, Philip, and I need you to run up here and take care of one man. I got one man on the road from Jerusalem to Gaza, and I need you to go preach the gospel to him. And so the Spirit takes him away. I've always wondered about that. Wouldn't you think, this is how humans think. Wouldn't you think that it'd be better for him to stay down there and keep on baptizing people? There's people responding everywhere, God. God said, no, you don't understand. Well, what was that all about? Now, we're not told specifically, but just know God's nature for a minute with me. And why in the world would God have Philip go, and again, we're not told specifically, why would he have Philip go up and teach this Ethiopian eunuch that's going to go all the way back to Ethiopia, essentially. He's going 1,000 miles from Jerusalem, about 1,000 miles. Why would he have him do that? Exactly. Steve, did you have something similar to this? She said Ethiopia, he was going to take the gospel back to where he lived. Yeah. Isn't this amazing? Human standard, human mind says, oh no, God, I can't go. I'm having a good gospel meeting here. There's good things happening. God says, no, you don't understand. I've got a man up there that needs taught the gospel. And what am I going to do? I'm going to double the gospel preaching. I'm going to send that man back down. He goes on his way rejoicing, Acts 8:39. He's excited about what he found. What's he going to do when he gets back home? What he's going to. Now, we're not told everything he did explicitly, but we know the nature of the church is, hungry beggar finds bread, tells other hungry beggar where to find bread. That's the story. And he goes down there, and now the gospel's just spreading in leaps and bounds in Acts 8. Acts 9, of course, God's got another plan for a man that was wreaking havoc on the church, Saul of Tarsus. He meets him on the road to Damascus, sends him into a preacher. He says, you get in there, I want you to go to Damascus, and there'll be a man come to you, and he'll tell you exactly what you need to do to be saved. Of course, Acts 10 and 11, and this isn't an overview of Acts, but I just want to show you how this thing flows. Acts 10 and 11, Peter is, shell-shocked that I have to go to this household of Cornelius. I don't think that's a good idea, God. Peter, that's where I want you to be, and I'm going to show you how important it is for you to go there. Of course, he has to really do some strange things for Peter. Sees this sheet. Lord, I just never have done anything like this. Peter, I want you to go do it. He does it. Cornelius and his household is baptized. Then we come to Acts 11, Peter reports back to Jerusalem and tells them what had happened, but I want you to notice verses 19 through 21 of Acts 11. Somebody read that for us. Acts 11, 19 through 21. Anybody that gets it? Now it'll give me a second to get a little drink here. Acts 11, 19 to 21. Barb, thank you. And verse 21, if you would. Thank you. This is so exciting for me. I hope this is exciting for you. Do you see what happened? So there's a persecution in Jerusalem, and you know what I'm doing. Like, I'm in Jerusalem, you know what I'm doing. I'm crying and whining and moaning to God. I can't believe, I have served God with I cannot believe you would do this to me, God. Here we are, we're just trying to preach the gospel, we're just trying to baptize people, and all of a sudden, these people that hate us, don't you care for us, God, right? Are you with me? Aren't you whining with me a little bit? Come on, you whine sometimes too, don't you? You're whining about it too because we don't understand it. I don't understand how God would do this to the church, and I just don't understand it. What good could come from this, honestly, Rodney? What good could come from this? I can just hear it right now. We're talking in a small group or something, and we're upset about it, aren't we? And we should be upset. But the problem is we see one-dimensional. God sees bigger than this. God says, you don't understand. I've got a plan here, and I'm going to use sinful man to finish my plan. And look at this. They go down, those that were scattered abroad. Don't forget this. I just want to emphasize this. Why were they scattered? They didn't have a home to live in anymore. They're being driven out. This is unreal, God. This is unbelievable. All I did was obey the gospel, and now I don't have a place to live. Now, I want you to just contrast that with what you might hear on Sunday morning on the television screen. What is the gospel? And it's not the gospel, by the way. It's another gospel, which is not really another, Paul would say in Galatians 1. It's a false gospel. What is being taught to many over the television screens in America today about if you just follow Jesus, what will happen to you? You'll get rich. You'll have your best Friday ever. There's a book out, Your Best Friday Ever. And some of them will preach to 10,000 people on Sunday. Why? How does that happen? I've had people ask me that in evangelism, in the story of evangelism. How does that happen? I'll tell you how that happens. Because they tell everybody what they want to hear. If you obey Jesus today, you're going to have your best life ever. You will have less problems, and your stresses will go away, and your depression, it'll be gone overnight. Your anxiety will go away. You'll get along with everybody. You'll have no internal problems, no external problems. God will be with you. He loves you. What do you think? Man, that's what I want to do, right? We all know nobody wants to have problems. But the bottom line is that's not how it works. Sometimes the very fact of obeying Jesus will automatically drive a wedge. You may lose your job. Why? Well, because Ronnie. I used to sell alcohol. Like that's what I was. I was a bartender. Now I've become the gospel. Now I've obeyed the gospel. What do I need to do? Like, are you telling me I need to just quit my job? Well, if you're serious about your faith, you're not going to be able to serve that poison to people anymore, right? Well, yeah, right. Okay. So you just become a Christian. What do? You just lost your job. Well, you don't understand. I'm on my 16th marriage, and nobody ever told me the law of marriage. Now I've obeyed the gospel and I realize that I'm living in adultery. What do you expect me to do? I'm telling you, sometimes you might have to leave the mate you're with. You may have to turn from, listen, this is not unbelievable in our world today. You obey the gospel, you may have to turn, well, you will have to turn if you are, from your homosexual lifestyle. Well, you just can't expect a person to change everything. I mean, like, they're happy. Yeah, but see, the gospel drives me to change. And that change sometimes brings about huge sacrifice. And that's what Jesus meant, I'm sure, and a lot more, when he said, hey, if you're going to be my disciple, you're going to pick up your cross, you're going to deny yourself, and you're going to follow me. And it's not always a big paycheck following me. It's not always everybody being happy with me. It's not always having a great unit in your family. You may be, think about that. Think about that. There's all kinds of things that can happen. This is the gospel story. This is it. But they went, and they preached the word everywhere. They went preaching the word. They didn't turn on Jesus, and I love it. They spoke, some of them, verse 19, Barb read it, they spoke the word to no one except the Jews. But then notice, I love this, but there were some of them, men of Cyprus and Cyrene, who came to Antioch and began speaking to the Greeks also. Who are the Greeks here? Yeah, but they were really, what nationality would they have been? If you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. Absolutely, it would have been Gentiles. And so notice he says they were preaching the word, the Lord Jesus, and the hand of the Lord was with them. And what happened next? Look at that last section. It's the last verse we read, last part of it. A great number of people were added. Why? The first part of this verse tells us why. The hand of the Lord was with them. They were preaching the gospel. Are you kidding me? The hand of the Lord's with me? Like, I don't have a place to live. I'm in persecuted. Yeah, the hand of the Lord is right with you. Why? Because he wants his message spread. And the best way for him to spread his message right now is to allow this persecution to happen. He could stop it. He's powerful enough to stop it. Oh, if he really loved you. Oh, he loves you more than anything. And he loves the whole world. He loves the world so much that he wants everybody to hear the gospel. Now, that's a loving God that will even let his children suffer persecution so that sinners will hear the gospel. And that's exactly what he did. That's the derivation of this congregation. Look at how this church started. It started in persecution. There's never been, in this story so far, there's never been a peaceful time for this church. They've had nothing. They started with problems, okay? The people that fled there were having filled with problems, and they come. Now, this is going to mean something, I think, even more to you when we see the next point, which is going to be the development of this church. I want you to see how they grew. Yeah, Sherry. Yeah. Absolutely. And isn't that interesting? What they found in Jerusalem, they didn't want to leave. They didn't want to leave. They found something that was great. Every day, house to house, preaching and teaching, eating their food together, taking the Lord's side. We don't want to leave this. And God said, I know y'all have a real nice little place right here. I know you're like really happy, but I need you to go somewhere else. Because my plan has always been for the gospel to go somewhere else. Go somewhere else. Yeah. Absolutely. Great point, Sherry. They recreated it. We're going to see this church grew, and they recreated something exactly what they had in Jerusalem, only now in a completely different, about 300 miles away. About 300 miles, they left and went back to Antioch of Syria. And then this church, and then we'll see it, it becomes the hub sending out Paul on missionary journeys. Sending out Paul and Barnabas, then Paul and Silas, and then, Timothy was, we'll get to that later, right? We'll get to that in the next section. But, Luke's with them. Like, this church became this nucleus of just gospel-filled love for everyone. And they're growing locally. Now, I just want to stop for a minute before we get to development. We're going to go into this development part, but I want us to think about this. I'll probably mention it again. They weren't concerned just with themselves. The church is not a museum where we want the relics to be dusted and taken care of and everything to be perfect. Okay, the church isn't a museum. The church exists to spread the gospel. We learned it. Somebody taught us, and now we have to. Now, the beautiful thing is God, right now, He lets us meet together and have what they had in Jerusalem. But as we go out on our little journeys, we're not going quite 300 miles to Antioch of Syria, but we're going out, 20 miles to our job. We're going out 5 miles to our families. We're going out 6 miles to the community, and we're influencing everyone in our path. Everyone we come to, man, I got to tell you the story. I got to tell you the story that affected my life, and we share the gospel. And the church grows. I think it's key that when we preach the gospel and we are worried and concerned, not worried, we're concerned about doing the Lord's mission, the hand of the Lord will be with us. When a church is no longer outwardly focused, if they are all inwardly focused, the hand of the Lord won't be with them. And you know what they'll be doing? They'll be wondering, why in the world can't we grow? Why in the world can't we grow? I've seen it. I know, I'm thinking of a congregation right now. A friend of mine was he was sending me the bulletin when he was there, and it was like, Tuesday night, the women meet at Red Lobster. Thursday night, the men meet at the coffee shop and visit together. And Saturday afternoon, and I'm like, well, that's great. I asked him one time, I was in a gospel meeting, I said, hey, brother, what are y'all doing? Like, are these out evangelistic out? No. Those are just for our members. We don't invite anybody. I'm like, well, how do you expect to grow? They were dying, by the way. Church was dying there. By the way, he left there. He went to another place. That church is about dead right now. Church is about dead. They were all inwardly focused. Everything was about them. And they had all kinds of programs. It wasn't that they were dead, but they weren't carrying out the mission of the church. Look at these people. They shared what they had with everyone. Look at the development. Let's watch the development. Number one, the development. They were a welcoming church, all right? A welcoming church. And I don't know where your blanks are, but I'll try to emphasize these, and then if there's a blank there, you can fill it in. Development, they were, number one, a welcoming church. Look at Acts 11, 19, and 20. Barb read that for us. How about somebody read Acts 15, 23. Brielle, you read that one for us, Acts 15, 23. And then someone read Acts 11, 25, and 26. Who would read that one for us? Stephen? Acts 11, 25, and 26. Let's look at Acts 11, 19, and 20 real quick. We'll just make mention of that. So they made their way. All these people came in. Now, these are people from different areas, right? Some from Cyprus, and what'd they do? They came in and they started speaking the word of the Lord. And they were in this together. And they welcomed each other. You see that in 19 and 20? Now I want you to see 15, 23. Go ahead, Riel. Chapter 15, verse 23. Okay, notice how welcoming these people were. Now, that's interesting. In Acts 15 is known as what we would call the Jerusalem Council. So there were Judaizing teachers, those that were teaching. Why we call them Judaizing teachers? You won't necessarily see that in the Bible. Sometimes you'll see the Judaizers, but I don't know if you'll see that exact matchup, Judaizing teachers. Yeah, I think you will. But they're there in principle if they aren't in exact words. What they would do is they would say, hey, you know what? You got to be basically keep some tenets of the law, keep some things of the law in order to become a Christian. So you want to become a Christian, that's all really well and good, but what you're really going to need to do is be circumcised first. And so if you're circumcised, then we can baptize you and you can become a member of the church. And the apostles said, wait a minute, there's a problem here. We've got some problems in the church. And they met together in Jerusalem, Acts 15, they met in Jerusalem, and they discussed it. They're like, what are we going to do about this? How's this going to work? And then they basically come down and they said, wait a minute, you don't need to keep the law of Moses in order to become a Christian. So that was huge because they were having a problem with Gentiles coming in. When Gentile came in, what was the odds of them being circumcised? Really high odds or really low odds? Really low odds. Yeah. Now to us, it's almost strange to discuss it today because almost everybody, and not everybody, and if you're not or don't, like if you have children and you decided not to circumcise, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Certainly don't need to circumcise to become a Christian. But in today's world, it almost goes without saying when you have a child. I think our boys, they asked us, but they might not have. Jolene would probably be able to tell me more about that. But they didn't have to. If they would have asked, it would have been, well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's just normal. Like most males are circumcised. That's just the way it works. In that culture, it didn't work that way. So there were lots of folks coming into the church, and they weren't circumcised. They had a real problem with the Jew. Okay, a Jew had a real problem with that. And so he's like, I can't worship with him. I can't. And there was a big division. But I want you to notice in Acts 15, they wrote the letter and they welcome who in particular in that, what Brielle read? Gentiles. We're writing this letter to you, the elders, the Gentiles. We love you guys. We're welcoming you. We're not an exclusive club. We're welcoming you. Have you ever been in a congregation? And I hope this wouldn't be the case here. I hope it wouldn't be the case here. I don't think it would be. But have you ever been in a congregation where you didn't feel welcomed? Yeah. I've been in a congregation, not just visiting a congregation. I'll just shut up right there before I get myself in trouble. But I've been in places like that. And I'll tell you what, it's kind of hard when you don't feel welcome, and you're kind of like, oh, okay, that's their family, and I guess the Nolfs are kind of over here, like we're our family. All right, well, that's okay. How does that make you feel, Stephen? Not too good, does it? Kind of almost you feel like you don't belong, right? Yeah, so this welcoming idea was huge. They opened their arms. It's one thing I love about the church here. I think we're a very welcoming group. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that we welcome sin. But you know what? When somebody comes in here as a visitor on Sundays, people are going to be talking to them. People are going to be visiting with them. People are going to be letting them know, you're welcome here. We're glad you're here. We want you to be here. You've thrilled us today to be here. That's the kind of spirit. That's the kind of spirit of Christianity. That's Christ. What would Christ do? If Christ was here, he is, by the way. But I mean, if he was here in physical body, and he's the head of the church, and somebody walks into his church, what do you think he would do? How you doing? Now, I'll tell you what, he'd run over and he'd say, hey, how you doing, man? I'm glad to see you. Yeah, you see these? I died for you. I died for you. I love you. And that's the kind of welcoming atmosphere the church needs to be. This church was that. All right, let's read Acts 11, 25 to 26. I think Stephen agreed to that.
Then Barnabas departed for Tarsus to seek Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. So that for a whole year they assembled with the church and taught a great many people, and the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch.
You can't make this stuff up. You can't make this stuff up. This is the Holy Spirit here. Barnabas went and found who? Go ahead, say it out loud. You know who it is. Saul. Yeah, the Apostle Paul. Now, wait a minute. Back up with me a little bit. The derivation of this church. How'd this church actually start? How'd this congregation start? What drove them to this area? Yeah, Saul. Sherry jumped right to it. I was going to say persecution, and then we were going to get down the line. Sherry just said, I see what you're getting at. Saul was the guy that caused this problem. Saul starts this whole thing. Oh, he's part of it. I won't say he started it. He was part of it. And they went everywhere preaching the word. And they get over there and they start a congregation. They take what, like Sherry said, they took what they had in Jerusalem and they replicated it over there. And then Barnabas goes and finds Saul. What do you think that Sunday morning was like? Christians walking in and saying, wait a minute, he looks familiar. That's that guy that held Stephen's coat. Or, the coats of those you'll mess that whole story up, Rodney. They were holding the coats of those that stoned Stephen. They might have been holding his coat too, I don't know, but it was the Lord's garments that they parted. That's him. That's him. We know him. He's the troublemaker. Barnabas said, hey, come on in here. Come on in here, Saul. I want you to see the congregation here. These are God's people. Hey, he's God's man now. He's God's man. He's converted to Christ. He's one of us. They assembled for a year together. I love that. You talk about welcoming. You talk about open arms. You talk about not holding any grudges, no bitterness. Now, we don't read everything. I know we don't read everything here. They might have struggled with some things, but the bottom line is that's a welcoming church. They loved one another. And I love that so much. Any comments on that? Yeah, Steve.
Saying was that I think all of us, whether we've been at church, been in different congregations or whatever, if we did or did not feel welcome, I think all of us have other experiences in life, whether it's a new job, how welcoming an office is, or wherever you're working might be.
Yeah.
People that you work with, any organization, whether it's when you're trying to help with coaching or like of course we need the scouts or something like that. All different groups. I used to do a fair amount of fundraising for scouts where I'd go visit different units. Some were very welcoming, and others would be like, who are you and what do you want?
Right. Yeah.
Or you're just there really, you're there for different purposes depending on what you're there for. So, some people, but some churches, unfortunately, they're going to be like, what's your agenda? What are you here for?
Yeah. Exactly. That's a great point. And we see that. And I'll tell you what, how do you feel? And that's a great point Steve brings up. How do you feel personally when you walk in? It may not affect you. Maybe you're one of the few that it doesn't. Now, I think it affects the majority of people. When you walk into somewhere, let's say you go in to get a cup of coffee somewhere, or you go into a restaurant somewhere, and they aren't very friendly. How do you feel? Even if the food's awesome, well, how do you feel about that? You expect better. Yeah. A smile costs you nothing. Like, just be happy, just smile. I'll tell you what, my tips, when I go into a restaurant, they're all based on friendliness. I can be without tea, the meal can be terrible, but one thing the waitress can do, Brielle, this is it, you got this. She or he can be friendly, and they can be kind. I get it, the food might be late, that's not your fault. That might be the cook's fault. It might not even be the cook's fault. It might be something in the kitchen. But when you come out, you can at least be kind. You can at least be friendly. Even if you're, you don't have to be bubbly, but you can be at least friendly. Hey, we're glad you're here. We're welcoming. And that's the same with the church. That's the same with the church, yeah.
When Angie and I were in Virginia a couple of weeks ago, 2 different nights we went out to different restaurants. And the first place was phenomenal. It was really neat. The amazing menu, very busy place. The second night, we're like, let's try this other place out. And we go in there, and it was, for them, it's very cold. Very cold out. It's off season. We go in, and it's in Williamsburg. It's called Jefferson. Well, we started going in and noticed that their decor is a little dated. There weren't as many people in there as the other restaurant the other night. And the waitresses were kind of running around really, really fast. And we started noticing the pictures on the wall. Like, yeah, this is a family business. Before we know it, the owner comes out, is talking to us like he's our best friend. Find out they're 4th generation owners from Greece. And, we had a great conversation with them because it was a slow night. And we went away feeling like, okay, yeah, it wasn't the nicest place, but we felt very welcome there.
Yeah.
We would recommend going there because of the welcome. And then we got to meet his son, who's also there working. And it was a great experience.
Yeah. And it completely changes your attitude toward that place. And that's the way the church should be. It really is. We should be welcoming folks. Hey, I'm not comparing us to a restaurant, okay? But man, we got something better than a good steak. All right. We've got love. We've got the love of Christ, and we ought to be able to share that with others. Yeah, great point. Excellent. Anything else? All right. They were a welcoming church. Number 2, I love this one. They were a preaching church. Look at Acts 11, and then let's look at 22 through 24. Acts 11, 22 through 24. Somebody read that for us. Who would like to read that one? James, thank you.
The news of these things came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent out Barnabas to go as far as Antioch. When he came and had seen the grace of God, he was glad and encouraged them all that with purpose of heart they should continue with the Lord. For he was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and a great
So he's just constantly telling others. And of course, Barnabas. What kind of man was Barnabas, Jerry? Very encouraging, wasn't he? He was a great man. He was encouraging. He's encouraging people. Listen, don't give up. You keep on fighting. Hey, we got here by persecution. There may be a little bit of problems, but we're going to keep going. Can you just hear Barnabas? Aren't you just endeared to him automatically when you read this? Like he's encouraging. He's telling them the good news. Listen, we're going to make it. We're going to make this. And I think that's important. He reports back. He tells others about what's going on. The church at Jerusalem sends him. Hey, Barnabas, you're one of our men. Go over there. Encourage them with the gospel. This is the kind of congregation. I'll be honest with you. When I look at this congregation, I think, man, if I was placing membership somewhere and I could read a letter or something like this, I'm placing membership to that congregation. I want to be where these people are. They're welcoming. They're preaching. This is great to me. Number 3, or letter C, I think, on your outline, actually. They were a missionary church. So, personally, I want us to make sure because oftentimes when we talk about missions, what do we usually mean? Going across the sea. We say, hey, is this church involved in missions? Oh, yeah. We send money to India, and we send money to China and Bangladesh. Yes, we're very missionary. I want you to notice they were missionaries, but personal missionaries. If you look at Acts 11:19 through 26, you see the missionary nature. They are spreading in Antioch of Syria the message right personally. They're sharing the gospel. We've read these passages already. Personally, they're a missionary church. Secondly, and I love this, passionately, they are a missionary church. So personally and then passionately. If you look at the passages that I have there, those are passages of Paul's missionary journeys. And every one of them started from this church. So you can kind of see them. They're like rallying around Paul. And of course, Barnabas goes on the first one. Barnabas is instrumental in this church. So listen, there's nothing wrong, and I don't want to leave this impression, so please understand this. There's nothing wrong with writing a check to a missionary and sending it out. There's nothing wrong with that. Missionaries need money. They need support. Absolutely. That's a great thing to do. But what we don't want to do as God's people is stop at that. Because I found sometimes it's easier to write the check and send it and then to feel like we've done all we could do instead of, wait a minute, I've got something to do too. That's what they're going to do. Paul, you're going to go. You and Barnabas go, and we're going to send you, and we're going to support you, and we're going to encourage you. But listen, while you're going, we're going to be doing some things back here too. We're not going to just let it all in your hands, Paul. And I think that's important. I think that's important for us to understand. Missionaries are great. Missionaries are great when they're across the seas. We need to support them. We need to be encouraging to them. We need to send them money when they are worthy of it. And if they're doing the Lord's work, they're worthy of it. I don't think we ought to just send money and forget about them. I think we ought to, be encouraged by what they're doing and find out what they're doing and be a part of that work. But in the same respect, we want to make sure, and I don't think we do that here, but we want to make sure we don't write a check and then say, God, we're very evangelistic. We wrote 3 checks to 3 missionaries this year. And I know congregations that do that. Yeah, Mike. Yeah, absolutely. Mike said missions start at home. The world is a mission field. When Jesus said go into all the world, sometimes we miss this whole point. We think he meant across the pond. He did. That's great. Let's go. But don't forget, it starts right in our own homes. It starts right across our streets. It starts right next door. It starts with our family, sometimes our grown family. It starts with our relatives, our extended relatives. It is all over. And sometimes I am the only one and you are the only one that could influence that person. A missionary will never reach my neighbor. A missionary will never reach my neighbor. Like we can send them to China all day long and they're not going to get my neighbor. God put me there. I'm the one that's going to be responsible for that. And not in a scary way, but we need to be concerned about those other ones. So these people were a missionary church, personally and passionately. I love it. Number, I guess letter D, they were a benevolent church. When you look at Acts 11:28-30, look at this. Now, at that time, verse 27, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would be certainly a great famine over all the world. And this took place in the reign of Claudius. And in the proportion that any of the disciples had means, each of them determined to send a contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea. And this they did, sending it in charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders. Now, like, these people aren't rolling in the dough, okay? There's a famine coming all over the world. And they aren't like, well, wait a minute. We probably better fill the root cellar here and like kind of keep everything here. Like, let's not be sending stuff out till we see how bad this famine is. You notice they don't do that? They say, wait a minute, man, we got to send some relief to our brethren. They need help. And they just get together and they start sending it, and they give it to Saul and Barnabas, and Saul and Barnabas take it to where? Who do Saul and Barnabas deliver it to? The elders. The elders. This is a very scriptural way, very, very scriptural way to do relief, benevolent work. Paul and Barnabas were heading that way. He gave it to them. They took it. They delivered it to the elders. Then what did the elders do? Well, we don't really have explicit statement, but if they were God's men, they were God's elders, what do you think they did? They distributed it. They distributed it to the people. Now, I say that to say this. Sometimes a church will become a savings bank. Sometimes a church will receive money and they pull it in and they save it for a rainy day. I know a couple congregations, I know a congregation right now, and I'm just in contact with these congregations. I'm not speaking poorly of them. Sometimes I talk to them, and fortunately they still talk to me. I kind of give them my thoughts on it too. Hey guys, you might want to think about this. We want to keep a little bit of money back, Rodney, because you never know. We might get flooded, the roof might cave in, something might happen. I think that's great. I think that's smart to prepare for a rainy day. I'm not so sure you need $300,000 to do that. Like, you have insurance, right? Yeah, we have insurance. Like, maybe that money could be used right now for the Lord's work. And this sometimes get me in trouble, but I said this. I said, okay, so say you keep it back for something that happens and the Lord returns. Oh, let's say he considers you having 5 talents. Do you suppose he wanted you to double those? Yeah, he did, didn't he? And this is just gospel. This is gospel. As humans, sometimes we want to store it up, don't we? But the Lord's work is different. We want to share it. We want to spread the gospel. We want to buy Bibles. We want to buy Bible correspondence courses. We want to, support World Video Bible School. Oh, my lands, have you been online for World Video Bible School? You have the app. You have it downloaded on your phone. I hope you do. It's a great resource. That stuff doesn't happen for free. Their milk cost is exactly what ours does. You may be a little bit more. Those are great works. That's not the only work. There's lots of great works. But I'm saying, man, if we got some, let's send it. Let's share it, right? Because when the Lord returns, he's not going to say, hey, how big of a bank account did you have? He's going to say, how much did you use for my glory? Yeah, Jess.
Scarcity versus abundant mindset. So the more you treat your money, if you're a good steward of your money, the Lord's going to keep blessing.
Absolutely.
Scarcity mindset, you're not going to keep getting money. So it's how do you use it? And I know being in sales, every time, I'll check myself if I get a little bit jealous or a little bit scared. So I'm like, just wait, it'll come. It always does. It always comes. And I've never put money in the collection plate that I regretted or needed. Money has always come back to me. So you just have to have that abundant mindset.
That's a great point. So Jess, if you couldn't hear her, she's talking about an abundant mindset. And kind of what she's saying is, you know what? I'm gonna paraphrase you, Jess. And if I paraphrase you wrong, correct me. You can't outgive God. You can't outgive God. You could try, but you won't do it. He will not. Now, somebody say, well, that's that health and wealth gospel you preach. No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying when we're generous with what God has given us, even as a congregation, God will bless us. This church was growing. They had everything they needed and more because the hand of the Lord was with them. Remember, when you're struggling, if God's not with you, no matter what you do as a congregation, it won't work. It will not work. There's just so many powerful passages in the New Testament that teach when the Lord builds the house, and I know Psalm 127 is dealing with the home, but the principle's the same. If God doesn't build the church, it will not be what it needs to be. So they were a very benevolent church. They shared what they have. One more. They were a growing church. No surprise here, right? Acts 11:24. He was a good man, Barnabas. He's full of the Holy Spirit and of faith. I don't know if you noticed this last part. And considerable numbers were brought to the Lord. Like they were growing. This church was growing. And it shouldn't be a surprise to us. Listen, and here it's so amazing to me how simple. How simple. Now we have to work. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's real. God's plan is real simple. It's a simple plan. Look at it. They were a welcoming church. They were a preaching church. They were a missionary church, personally at home and abroad. They were a benevolent church. What follows? They were a growing church. They were a growing church. And the beautiful part, actually we're going to do one more, if you can just bear with me one second. The last mention of this great church is in Acts chapter 18. And sometimes Luke does this for us in the book of Acts. He kind of leaves us, I'm not impugning the Holy Spirit here. Sometimes the story is told exactly what we need to know, but sometimes he lets us hanging. This is the last mention of this church, Acts 18, 22 and 23, and then we'll move next week to the difficulties. So Acts 18, 22 and 23, when he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and went down to Antioch. And having spent some time there, he left and passed successively through the Galatian region and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. And this is about all we're going to hear about Antioch of Syria in the book of Acts. Let me just make one comment about that. Sometimes people say, why did Luke leave us hanging? Like at the end of the book of Acts, Paul's in Rome. You know what I mean? He's in Rome and he's under, like, what happened to Paul? What was the rest of the story with that occasion? Luke is giving us what we need in order to show us the early church. He's not writing a story necessarily about what happened to the church at Antioch of Syria. He's not writing a story exactly what happened to Paul. He's writing a story to show us an overview of some of the acts of some of the apostles, not all the acts of all the apostles. Remember that. The Bible, it's not meant to answer every single question we have, like, where did Cain get his wife? That's not the redemption story. Okay, there are things that aren't going to be answered that really sometimes our human minds matter, but they really don't matter to the redemption story. And so just remember that when you're studying the Bible, sometimes there will be things that you're like, oh, I wonder where that happened. But don't get hung up on it, because the redemption story is plain and clear throughout the Bible, and God painted that picture. This church was a great church. They were a great congregation of God's people. I think one that you and I could emulate. There are some things in this church that we could certainly do. Now, next week we'll come back. We'll talk about the difficulties. They did have some difficulties, and we're going to talk about some of those difficulties and how they were handled. In fact, some of the difficulties they had were pretty big difficulties. They weren't just little things, and they really could have split this church, but they didn't. Then we're going to have some discussion questions. I have about 4 here that we're going to share. Feel free to bring your discussion questions. If you have a question or a comment about this great congregation, come and bring it, and we'll see if we can't discuss it. And then we'll finish that up, and then we are moving into one of my favorite congregations in the New Testament, the Philippian church. Oh, what a great congregation this will be. I can't wait to study that one with you as well. Are there any questions or comments regarding our study tonight? Yes, Mike. Right. Yeah, it's a good point, Mike. Yeah. Right, right.
And the Gentiles, they just had who knows what.
Right.
It was easy to, I shouldn't say easy, but it was more probable that they would find
Right.
to be something they want.
That's a great point. So if you couldn't hear Mike, he said, today we have the Gentiles, and we get some of those Gentiles, like the heathen, in the world. We're Gentiles too, but talking spiritually. But the denominations have really hurt the gospel story in some ways, and a lot of that reason, I think, is because some people are content where they're at. They're just sometimes when you're content. And a lot of people view it like this, unfortunately. They view it like, well, that's cool. You shop at Walmart, and I really like Aldi. And it's kind of like you and I arguing over, we'll break it down, like if you like to go to L&L or Wanger's or Whispering Pines. Most of you know what I'm talking about there. Like, well, Whispering Pines is a lot better. I'd be a fool to say that, It just depends on what you like. Be honest with you, I like all three of them. And if I could just go there all the time, I love them. But, why? Because they're all three similar, but they all have three different things. And so it'd be silly for us to argue. That's how people a lot of times view religion. Oh, you go down there, you go to Wanger's. Oh, that's cool. Okay, I go over here to L&L. I like L&L a lot. And it's not like we're searching for the one grocery store that will give us eternal life. And it's not a grocery store, obviously. So, yeah, that's a great point. Satan's good at what he does. He dupes people a lot. Yeah, absolutely. All right, excellent. Thank you so much for coming to class.